The chair had been empty for months, not just physically, but in a way that settled into people's mornings like a quiet ache they couldn't quite explain. Morning television has a rhythm to it, a familiar pulse that millions of Americans sync their days to without ever consciously deciding to. The alarm goes off, the coffee brews, the television comes on, and for years, the voice that met them in that space was hers, steady, warm, certain in a way that made uncertainty feel manageable. And then, one morning, it wasn't there anymore, for a while. The absence was explained away in careful, measured language. Health reasons, the network said. She needed time. Her colleagues stepped into the space with the kind of grace that broadcast professionals spend careers learning, smiling through the gap, maintaining the rhythm, never letting the audience see the full weight of what was missing. But audiences are perceptive in ways that can't always be articulated. They felt it anyway. They always do. Weeks passed, then more weeks, then the kind of extended silence that stops feeling like a pause and starts feeling like something else. Messages flooded social media in waves that didn't slow down. Where is she? Is she okay? When is she coming back? These weren't the questions of passive viewers looking for entertainment. They came from somewhere deeper, from the kind of genuine attachment that forms slowly, almost invisibly, over years of shared mornings and shared headlines and shared moments of grief, and joy broadcast live into the most private spaces of people's homes. They weren't missing a television personality. They were missing someone who had become, in the quiet and particular way television allows, part of the texture of their daily lives. And then the announcement came, not in the way anyone expected, not wrapped in the usual network packaging or press release language. It arrived raw and direct and entirely on her terms. And when it did, it changed something, not just about what people knew, but about what they understood had been happening all along, just out of view. Nobody saw it coming. Not like this. To understand why that moment hit so many people so hard, you have to go further back than the headlines, further back than the absence itself. You have to return to who Savannah Guthrie was, before she became the face you recognize, before the desk, before the morning light, before a decade of mornings that made her voice feel as familiar as someone you actually know. She didn't arrive at the Today Show fully formed. Her path to that chair was longer and more layered than most people realize. Before journalism, there was law, years of it, and legal training does something to the way a person thinks that doesn't disappear. When the career changes, it builds precision. It develops an instinct for pressure testing what's presented as truth. It teaches a person to sit with complexity without rushing toward easy conclusions. When she moved into broadcast journalism, all of that came with her, not loudly, not in a way that announced itself, but woven quietly into everything she did. Underneath the warmth, underneath the ease, it was always there. She joined NBC News in 2008. And her rise was the kind that doesn't make for dramatic storytelling, because it was built on something less exciting than luck or timing. It was built on work. She covered the White House. She tracked elections. She sat across from some of the most powerful people in the country and pressed them with a calm, unhurried persistence that made them visibly uncomfortable without ever raising her voice. She wasn't relentless in a loud way. She was relentless in the way that patient people are. Because they've come to understand that patience, applied steadily, cuts deeper than aggression ever could. By the time she became co-anchor of Today in 2012, something had already taken root between her and the people watching. Not a fan relationship, something quieter than that, a trust. The kind that doesn't get manufactured in a boardroom or engineered by a PR team. It gets built one morning at a time, across years. Through the accumulation of small moments where someone shows up and does exactly what they said they would. Her personal life became part of the story too, not in the way celebrity lives usually become stories, but in a more human register. Her marriage, her children, born later in life than she had expected. Her faith, which she spoke about openly and with a groundedness that didn't seek validation. These weren't calculated disclosures. They felt real because they were real. And that realness is exactly what made her eventual absence feel so personal to people who had never once shared the same room with her. She wasn't just a television anchor. She was familiar in the truest sense of that word. And when she disappeared from the screen, the people who had given her their mornings for more than a decade were left holding something that no official statement fully addressed. For a long time before any of it became visible, everything looked exactly as it always had. Savannah was at the desk. The show moved through its segments with the comfortable predictability that regular viewers depend on: interviews, headlines, the lighter moments in the third hour, the easy exchanges between co-anchors that take years to develop and look effortless once they do. From the outside, there was nothing that suggested disruption was coming. But morning television carries enormous pressure in the spaces the camera doesn't reach. The hours alone are punishing: pre-dawn call times, the relentless demand for energy and emotional presence in a format that has no tolerance for off days or visible fatigue. Anchors carry real lives beneath those lights: health concerns, family pressures, private struggles that never make it onto the broadcast. They carry all of it behind composed expressions day after day. Because the show requires it, and because the professionalism they've built over careers demands it, the audience sees the surface. They very rarely see what it costs. According to reports from people familiar with the situation, Savannah had been moving through a period of significant personal and physical challenge in the time leading up to her departure. The details, as they filtered out over time, carried none of the weight of scandal. They were simply human, a body communicating something important that couldn't be deferred indefinitely. A decision described by those close to her as one that didn't come quickly or easily: to step back and attend to herself in a way that her schedule had never previously made possible. The network handled the transition with a discretion that said something meaningful in an industry not always defined by it. No dramatic announcement, no language that invited speculation. Her colleagues spoke about her with genuine warmth whenever the subject arose, which was often. Hoda Kotb, her longtime co-anchor and close friend, referenced her in ways that communicated real care without overexposing what was private. That restraint, sustained over months, reflected something about the relationships involved that no press release could have conveyed. But the silence, however professional, created its own pressure, because silence, when it stretches long enough, starts to generate its own narrative. And the public, caring, attentive, and now genuinely concerned, began to fill it. There's a particular kind of worry that builds around someone the public has grown close to. When the official explanations stop feeling sufficient, it doesn't require ill intent. It doesn't grow from gossip. It grows from care, from the specific discomfort of not knowing whether someone you've trusted with your mornings for years is actually okay. And that worry, when it has nowhere to go, becomes its own kind of noise. Social media became the landscape for all of it. Fan accounts that had long tracked morning television with quiet dedication began documenting her absence with a specificity that reflected just how deeply some viewers had been paying attention. Old posts were revisited. Colleagues' offhand comments and interviews were replayed and analyzed. Every carefully worded NBC statement was examined for what it might be protecting. The collective attention was striking, not in a frantic way, but in the way that genuine concern tends to manifest when people have no other outlet for it. Then, according to multiple reports, the first substantive indication emerged that what was unfolding was more serious and more prolonged than the initial statements had implied. The specifics remained guarded, as they should have. Personal health belongs to the person experiencing it, and the restraint shown by everyone close to the situation reflected an understanding of that. But the confirmation that something real was happening, something that required more than rest and more than time, shifted the entire tone of the public conversation. The speculation about career decisions and behind-the-scenes dynamics faded almost immediately. What replaced it was quieter and more honest, genuine worry, an outpouring of messages that had a different quality to them, less curious, more tender, because there is a threshold in the relationship between a public figure and their audience. And when someone crosses from familiar to beloved, the news that they are struggling lands differently. The distance collapses. Something more personal takes its place. It was inside that shift, that quieter, more careful public moment, that the first signals began to emerge. Something was coming. She had something to say, and it was going to arrive in her own time, in her own words, without anyone else shaping what it meant. The announcement itself didn't come through the channels that usually carry news of this kind. There was no coordinated release, no prepared statement distributed to press contacts. It came the way things come now, through a moment that existed before any framing could be placed around it. A post, her face, her words, direct and unmediated, looking into a camera after months of absence with the particular expression of someone who has traveled somewhere difficult and returned with something to show for it. The response was immediate, and what made it striking was how consistent it was across every platform, every demographic, every degree of prior familiarity with her work, relief, recognition, something that felt collective in a way that is rare, a shared exhale from people who hadn't fully realized how much tension they had been quietly holding until the moment it was allowed to release. She spoke about her time away without minimizing what it had been, and without turning it into performance. That balance, the ability to be honest without manufacturing emotion, to be open without being exposed, has always been the quality that made her different from broadcasters, who are simply good at their jobs. She acknowledged what people had expressed. She received it with gratitude that felt proportionate rather than theatrical. And she said she was returning, not because she was obligated to, not because the network required it, but because she was ready. That single word carried more weight than paragraphs of explanation could have. Ready, because stepping back into something as relentless as live morning television after a serious health challenge isn't simply a matter of showing up. It's a decision that has to be made at a level deeper than logistics. It requires a kind of internal certainty, the difference between hoping the ground will hold and knowing it will. The way she said it suggested she had done that work, that what people were witnessing wasn't the performance of recovery. It was recovery itself. Extended absences reveal things about people that their consistent presence never quite allows. When someone fills a role reliably, day after day, it becomes easy to take for granted the specific weight of what they carry, the preparation that goes into every segment, the emotional labor of delivering difficult news without flinching, of conducting interviews that require both genuine empathy and intellectual rigor, of being fully present as a human being in front of millions of people. Before most of those people have cleared the fog of early morning, these things don't register when they're happening seamlessly. They only become visible in their absence. What emerged, slowly, during the months Savannah was away was a clearer picture of the specific thing she brought to that desk. Not talent in a general sense. Morning television has no shortage of talented broadcasters. Something more particular, a quality of presence that the artificiality of the medium usually dilutes, but that somehow survived in her. A sense, reliable across years of watching, that the person on screen was actually there, actually moved by what was moving, actually troubled by what was troubling, actually connected to the reality on the other side of the broadcast. The people who worked beside her said it in their own ways during the period she was gone. The word that kept surfacing, in different conversations and different contexts, was grounding, steadying, the kind of presence, according to those who knew what it felt like to work alongside it every morning, that becomes invisible when it's there and enormous when it isn't. Her audience arrived at the same understanding through a different route. The messages that continued throughout her absence weren't simply expressions of missing a familiar face. They were reaching towards something more specific, a quality of reassurance that the noise and weight of the morning news cycle was being held by someone who could genuinely be trusted to hold it, someone who remembered, always, that there were real people watching. That is not a common thing, and the months without it made that undeniable to people who might never have found the words for it before. A return like hers is never as simple as it appears from the outside, even when the outside view is warm and the welcome is everything anyone could have hoped for. The person who comes back is not identical to the person who left, not worse, not diminished, but different in the way that moving through something genuinely hard always changes the interior of a person, whether or not that change announces itself visibly. The questions that accompany a return like this tend not to get asked aloud. What does it mean to reenter a schedule of this intensity after a period of actual recovery? Have the conditions that preceded the departure been examined, and where it was possible, changed. Morning television is not a flexible institution. It has its own momentum and its own appetite, and it has historically been indifferent to the limits of the people who sustain it. The question of how someone comes back into that, not just professionally but as a whole person, deserves more attention than it usually receives in conversations about public figures returning from health-related absences. According to reports surrounding her return, Savannah approached these questions with a seriousness that went largely unseen. Sources familiar with her thinking described someone who had used the time away for more than physical recovery, someone who had examined what her life looked like from a distance and made deliberate choices about what she wanted it to look like going forward. Time with her family in a way the schedule had rarely permitted. A reconnection with things that existed outside the accelerating demands of broadcast news. A recalibration, quiet and unhurried, of what actually mattered. That process, if it holds, and those who know her seem to believe it will, may prove to be the most significant thing that occurred during the months she was away. More significant, in the long run, than the return itself. Because the return is what people could see. The recalibration is what will determine everything else. And in the long run, it is always the quiet internal work that decides whether someone comes back whole, or simply comes back present. The anticipation that surrounded her reappearance carried all of this complexity beneath its warmth. People were happy. That was genuine. But they were also watching in a particular way, attentive to something beyond the fact of her presence, hoping that what had been hard had also, in some way that defies easy description, been worth something. There's a reason this story reached people who don't normally follow morning television, who couldn't name the show's other anchors, who might have difficulty explaining what drew them to click in the first place. It's because the specific details, the network, the anchor, the announcement, are only the surface of what the story is actually about. Underneath those details is something that moves through the lives of most people. In one form or another, we live inside a culture that holds a complicated, often contradictory relationship with rest. It applauds resilience while quietly penalizing the vulnerability that makes resilience necessary in the first place. It celebrates the return without examining whether the conditions that made departure inevitable have been meaningfully addressed. Savannah Guthrie stepping away from one of the most visible roles in American media, and then stepping back into it on her own terms, in her own time, is a story that touches something most people are navigating privately. The ongoing tension between what the world demands and what a person genuinely needs. The difficulty of choosing yourself in a moment when everything around you is asking you not to. Her return announcement landed the way it did, not simply because it was unexpected, but because of the quality it carried when it arrived. There was no apology in it, no feverish energy, no performance of being fine. What came through, in the stillness of her expression, in the measured way she spoke, was the particular piece of someone who had actually done the work, not rested, done the work, and arrived somewhere real on the other side of it. That is not a small thing. In a professional environment where the machinery runs continuously, and the pressure never fully lifts, arriving somewhere real is something close to extraordinary, whether what she found during her time away holds against the weight of what she's returning to, whether the clarity survives contact with the schedule, the early mornings, the relentlessness of the format. No one can say with certainty. What can be said is that she came back differently than she left, and somehow, without needing it explained, the people watching seem to understand that. They're not simply rooting for her to be back, they're rooting for her to be well. And those two things are not the same. They have never been the same. If something in this story stayed with you longer than you expected, if it touched something that went beyond the headline, take a moment to share what it brought up for you in the comments below. Stories like this matter not because of who they're about, but because of what they reflect about the rest of us, what we ask of people, what we rarely give them permission to need. If you want more stories told this way, with care, with depth, with space to actually sit with something, consider subscribing. It means more than the number suggests.